Over the past 20 years, Xbox has released just 5 main controllers that have come packaged with their consoles. The massive original Duke, the smaller Controller S, the iconic Xbox 360 controller, the Xbox One, and of course, the newest edition, the Xbox Series X. And here's the question. Did Xbox controllers actually get better with each generation? Or did they peak years ago? People often argue about which is actually the best. Some say the legendary 360 controller, for example. Others say the Duke, and others think the more modern version. So today, I'm going to rank all 5 of the core controllers, and I guarantee that there's going to be a little bit of controversy, and that a lot of people might disagree with at least one of the placements. And before you watch the video and get influenced by my opinion, let me know what order you'd put the 5 controllers in the comments down below. And where else to begin but with the Xbox Duke controller. So this is the original controller that came bundled with the first original Xbox. And it kind of replicates what Xbox was all about at that time and the console itself. You know, the Xbox was meant to be this big, powerful, beefy gaming machine. And the controller certainly mirrors that. This thing is huge. It's probably like the biggest controller I've got in my collection. And yeah, looking back on it now, it is obviously like hugely nostalgic for most Xbox fans. It's iconic. A lot of Xbox fans defend it and do love playing with it. So firstly, what did it do right? Well, I've always loved the fact that it's got these extra 2 buttons at the top. The 6 buttons is very much like Sega-esque, what Sega used to do. And they're great for things like fighting games. You know, modern day controllers, certainly on the PlayStation, Xbox, and the Switch, all just have the 4 buttons there. So yeah, these 2 buttons are great. It was way ahead of its time in terms of triggers. So the very first original Xbox had triggers on the back, believe it or not, which PlayStation didn't introduce until the PlayStation 3 generation later. And I guess what's carried forward most from this controller to the modern day Series X is the fact that the joysticks are, I think it's called asymmetric, where they're not level like the PlayStation, so the joysticks are actually offset. And that, for most people, a lot of people agree, that is just comfier way to play. It makes more sense. It had 2 memory card slots in the top, and obviously this thing is wired and it doesn't have bumpers on the top either. And the other thing that I love about the original Xbox controller, about the Duke controller, that we've kind of lost with modern day Xboxes a little bit, I mean it still is a feature but not so much, is the massive logo in the middle. I am like a sucker for branding and marketing, all that kind of stuff, and I love having the Xbox button there in case you forget what you're playing, what console you're on. Yeah, I just really, really like it. It's just another kind of like powerful symbol on there, and I love that. So the negatives about this controller are, the D-pad is very, very kind of like squashy for me. I don't like the D-pad at all. In fact, you know, I know some of the later edition controllers that we're going to talk about had very controversial D-pads, but for me, this is potentially the worst on this original Duke. And then the size. Now, yeah, this thing's too big. I mean, people were immediately kicking off. People loved the Xbox as a console, but the Duke controller was just too big, essentially. And that's why Xbox fairly swiftly decided to update the controller and instead introduced the Xbox Controller S. So yeah, we're still talking about the original Xbox here. We haven't moved any more generations forward. The amount of feedback that they got on the Duke controller, mainly that it was too big and bulky, they decided to quickly refine the controller and start shipping the console out with this updated controller, which I guess, first of all, is substantially smaller than the original. However, this controller also changed a few other things as well. Nothing too drastic, but some things for the better and some not for the better, in my opinion. So first of all, I guess one of the negatives for me is that the start and stop button moved down here. Now, this just doesn't feel right. I don't know why they moved them down here. Obviously, they had to get rid of, you know, room here to make the controller smaller, so there's less room on it. They also reduced the size of the logo. But yeah, the start stop button down here kind of didn't work, and as we'll see, you know, in future Xbox controllers, they then reverted back towards the center of the controller. The black and white button, again, moved from the top of the console to the bottom, and that's just because they were utilizing a lot of games less. So having the 4 colored iconic A, B, X, and Y buttons a little bit higher up, which is a little bit more comfortable, made more sense, especially in my opinion. I know some people who, again, fighter game people, do prefer having the black and white buttons above these, but for me, this made a lot more sense. It retained the triggers on the back, and this time they were slightly smaller, and in my opinion, feel slightly better. And they also improved the D-pad, and yeah, for me, much better D-pad. Still not the best D-pad we've had on an Xbox controller, but definitely an improvement on the Duke. And finally, obviously the biggest benefit by far is how good this thing feels. So in my hand, I absolutely love this even today. I've got fairly big hands. I just think this is, again, like the Duke, but more so way ahead of its time. You know, having the asymmetric joysticks and having triggers on a controller that is what now, like pushing on 30 years old almost. I mean, they could release this today and it would still be a great controller. However, next up, with the next generation, Xbox went through the biggest changes in their controllers today with the 360 controller. And yeah, first of all, as you can see, massive changes. The first one is there is no wire. So this was Xbox's first wireless controller. Similar to PlayStation, who also went for their first wireless controller on the PlayStation 3, as Xbox did on the Xbox 360. And yeah, that was a huge plus. Now, unlike the PlayStation 3, which was a rechargeable controller, Xbox opted for a battery compartment on the back. And this had quite mixed, even to this day, has quite mixed opinions. For me, as I've said in previous videos, I massively prefer having batteries. You know, I own a PlayStation 5, I own a Switch, and I own an Xbox Series X, as well as the older retro consoles as well. And yeah, I've got some rechargeable batteries that are always, I've got 4 in there, and I've always got 2 on charge, always 2 in my controller. It means I never ever have to plug this thing in, or any of my controllers. I can just take 2 batteries out of there, pop them in a controller, and I can play. And what I do is, as soon as them 2 are dead, I just switch them over with the other 2 in the thing. So I've never got to worry about charging a controller, never got to worry about plugging it in and sitting close to the TV. There's nothing worse when I got on my PS5 and I've got to charge the controller and either sit close to the TV or wait half an hour for it to charge. So yeah, to this day, I think the batteries, for me, is a big plus, and I certainly am in favour of it. Other big changes to this controller were the addition of bumpers on top, which Xbox were a little bit slow to add, given that the PlayStation 1, maybe, and the PlayStation 2 had bumpers, and you had R1 and R2, obviously, you had 4 buttons on top. Although they didn't have triggers as early as Xbox, they had the 4 buttons on top. But Xbox, yeah, replicated that, and they added the 2 bumper buttons, which have stayed with the controller ever since. As I mentioned before, the start and stop buttons moved back into the center, and the joysticks remained asymmetric, meaning this controller, again, is super comfy even today. So the 2 negatives that I have with this controller are, firstly, the D-pad. So most people agree that the D-pad on this controller was, like, it's so mushy. It just is not nice to use. It's mushy. It was kind of inaccurate most of the time. And they did actually update this partway through the life cycle of the 360, like with this Modern Warfare one here, where the D-pad could actually rotate, and you could either have the older style or you could twist it and have a much better, I guess similar to PlayStation. If you've used one of these controllers in the past, you know what it feels like. But yeah, big improvement to the D-pad partway through the generation. Now, something else that I wasn't a massive fan of was the base of the controller. So where you plug the headset in, this is not a normal aux cable or a 3.5mm jack, whatever you call it, headphone jack or microphone jack. Instead, it was Xbox's own design, and that means you only could buy certain headsets to work on the controller. Unlike what we'll discuss in a second with the Xbox One controller, where you can pretty much have the same headset for a PC or PlayStation or Xbox, just meant that having their own connector at the bottom meant that you were stuck with a headset for the Xbox. I, for example, had a PlayStation 3 as well, and I had to have a separate headset for each one, as well as my PC. And the only other thing that I think slightly hinders how comfy this controller is actually the battery packs. Although I do prefer batteries, like I've said, on this, the battery pack protrudes quite a lot. It doesn't seamlessly fit with the controller, it sticks out a lot. And when you are playing, your fingers are kind of resting upon it. Sometimes it's hard to know where to put. If you've got longer hands like me, bigger hands like me, then it is sometimes a little bit faffy about where you put your fingers on the back. Especially if you played a long time, the ridges at the bottom here, for example, can dig into your fingers. But overall, absolutely incredible controller. When you compare this to the PlayStation 3, which is one of the most, in my opinion, uncomfiest controllers ever, this knocks it out of the park. Everything about this, in my opinion, is better than the PS3 controller. And again, this is not a console wars video, but yeah, they smashed it like most things with the Xbox 360. Microsoft smashed this controller out of the park. And then we move on to some of the more modern day controllers. And yeah, the Xbox One controller. I mean, this thing is just brilliant. By this point, Xbox had, refined from the Duke to the S, which then kind of set a precedent of what they were doing with the controller. It was super comfy. The 360 had loads of new features, like wireless play, etc., the extra bumpers, stuff like that. And yeah, Xbox knew what they were doing with the controller. They knew they had a comfy controller, so they didn't have to change it that much. And yeah, they didn't change it that much, but they just changed the subtle things to enhance it even further. See, the first thing to notice is that it is very, very slightly bigger. Now, not by much. However, what they did do is on the back, they got rid of that little battery bump that I was talking about. So it's now seamless into the controller, which makes it, for me, a lot more comfy, especially for those longer game sessions. The triggers also became much better. Rather than just like one little thin bit of trigger on the back, they kind of wrap around the side of the controller, which makes them much easier to press. And given triggers were kind of embedded in every game, you know, whether it's a driving game or a shooting game, you know, especially this right trigger is probably the most pressed button on a controller these days. That was really important, and I mean, that is just super satisfying. It's so satisfying, the triggers on this controller. Yeah, absolutely love it. Now, annoyingly, Xbox did change the bottom of the controller, but again, at least for the first part of the generation, they kept it with an Xbox kind of like exclusive connectivity, which meant you still had to continue buying Xbox headsets, and you couldn't, again, use a typical aux one that you might use for a PC or a PlayStation. And some of the features that added to this controller that you might not be aware of is that this can connect to a PC or your smartphone. So the Bluetooth connectivity in here, then you could just connect this to a smartphone. You still can today if you've got one lying around, you know, go give it a try. Or your PC, and you're going to have it synced up to a console, a phone, and a PC, kind of all at the same time. It's really seamless to just switch between each one. And you can map buttons on here, so you can have different profiles for different games. And Microsoft also added a typical USB connector to the top, which made it much easier. You know, with a 360, I forgot to mention, but with a 360, you had to buy a play and charge kit from Microsoft, which again meant you had to, you know, purchase theirs at their price and everything. Whereas a lot of people have USB cables lying around the house for phones, MP3 players, that kind of stuff. And yeah, it just meant that if you had a wire, you could plug it in and use the controller wired through that way, or on a PC or on an Xbox. So by this stage, Xbox had basically nailed their design. You know, their controllers were all brilliant. You know, the 360 was great, the Xbox One was great, so they didn't have to change too much. And guess what? With the Xbox Series X, they didn't. So first of all, unless you knew what you were looking for, these controllers can pretty much be mistaken as the same generation, as the same model. They look super, super similar, and essentially they have the same or a very similar shell, meaning they feel exactly the same in the hands. So what did they change with the Series X, and why did they make it better? So first of all, again, they updated the D-pad. Like every single iteration of the controller we've seen, Microsoft have tampered with the D-pad trying to get it perfect. And this is probably the best one they've ever done. It added the little diagonal corners back in, and the clicking on this one is super satisfying. They added a share button to the controller, which 15 years ago probably wasn't relevant or needed, but today is, in my opinion, really, really handy. Not just as a content creator, but even if I'm playing with my mates online and something funny happens, or I'm playing by myself and something really cool happens in a game, it's really handy to just press the button or hold it, take a quick photo or short video, and it uploads straight to my mobile app. They finally added a standard aux cable to the bottom, a standard jack, meaning that your headset can now plug in to the Series X controller. Your headset from your PC or your PlayStation 5, your general headset, can plug into this thing and you are good to go. And they updated the charge cable to USB-C, which again for me was quite ahead of its time, given that the Series X is now like 6 years old, I think. Knowing that USB-C was going to be the norm moving forward was kind of a big decision for Xbox, but they did it, they put it into this controller. And yeah, that's also really, really handy when, you know, I've got tons of USB-C cables lying around the house now for phones and headphones and no matter what it might be. So it just means it's universal and it works with kit you've already got, which makes it a lot more accessible to people. Now you can also map buttons on this. So if you go in your Xbox accessories kind of app or in the settings on your Xbox, you can map buttons to do different things, and you can set up different profiles for different games if you want buttons to do certain things for certain games. Again, making it more accessible, more customizable, and just a better controller in general. And then finally, you know, like we've already mentioned, it's a very, very similar shell to the Xbox One controller, but they did include a couple of upgrades. and they are very subtle, but they do make quite a big difference. So the first one is the textures on the top of the joysticks and triggers, which just make it a little bit more grippy for your finger, less likely to slide off, and the rubberized grips on the inside of the two kind of handles. And again, these aren't massive features, but A, they make it more comfortable and more grippy, and B, they make the controller just feel more premium. And if you're paying £50–60 for a controller in 2026, look, you want it to feel premium. You're paying a lot of money for it. You want it to be sturdy, premium, and a good controller, and that is exactly what this one is. So there's no doubt that this is technically the best controller they've ever made, but does it beat the comfort and feel of the Xbox 360? Okay, so this is where things are going to get controversial, because how would I rank all of the controllers? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rank these in two separate lists. So firstly, I'm going to rank them in order of, if I'm sitting down to play one today, what do I want to play? Which is the best? This is not taking nostalgia into account or when they came out. Just purely sit down today, which am I going to play and why? And then secondly, we'll relist them again, but kind of taking other stuff into account. So which ones, you know, for the time they came out, how good were they, etc. So first list, here we go. At number 5 is the Xbox Duke controller. Look, we already mentioned a lot about this controller early on. It did some things really well, but for me, it's too bulky, it's too big, it's not comfortable in the hand to play for long sessions. Even myself, who's 6'1" and has big hands. It's missing key features like bumpers, it's not wireless, and yeah, if I'm playing on my original Xbox, I'm not going to use this, I'm going to use the Xbox Controller S, which is why that is number 4 on the list. And I've already said this was ahead of its time, and it was ahead of its time. It did so much right. It really paved the way for the next 3 controllers that we've already talked about, and kind of like established how Microsoft controllers on the Xbox were going to look and feel. But once again, it's just not as good as the controllers that came after it. Doesn't have the features of those controllers, and for that reason it has to be at number 4. And number 3 is probably the one that's going to get the most here, or people might disagree with the most, and that's because I'm choosing the Xbox 360 controller. Now again, I've mentioned this is the controller I've spent the most time with. I've probably got the most nostalgia for because of how much I played the 360 growing up, and there is literally hardly anything wrong with this controller at all. You know, it is probably ranked as one of the best controllers ever made, and rightly so. It's just that Microsoft got even better, and the next 2 controllers they did built on this even further. As much as I want this to be number 1, it's just not quite as good as the next 2 controllers. And it's pretty obvious which way around I'm going to rank these 2, given they're so similar, but one is slightly better than the other. So the Xbox One comes in at number 2, and the Xbox Series X is, look, not just the best Xbox controller in my opinion, but this is the best video game controller ever made. I think it's pretty much faultless, it is fantastic, and yeah, it works really well. And yeah, shout out to the Xbox One controller, which I think does very little wrong, but Microsoft improved on it even further with the Series X. So how would I change this list if I was ranking it based on when they came out, you know, for the timing, how revolutionary they were, the features, etc. I would do this. I would put the Xbox One in 5th place. Now, that might feel harsh, but for me, the Xbox One was a bit of a failure of a console, Microsoft's worst console for sure. And if I'm jumping back into that generation of games, I played them on my Series X, and I'm going to use the Xbox Series X controller, meaning I have no reason to use this today. It's kind of redundant now. And yeah, despite it being a great controller, that's why it sits number 5 on this list. No nostalgia for it at all. And number 4 is going to be the Duke. And that's just because, again, like I've already mentioned, for me, the Controller S is slightly better than this. So if I am going to play my OG Xbox, I'm going to use the Controller S because I think it's comfier, especially for those longer gaming sessions. So this would be at number 3. And again, like I've said, this is way ahead of its time. You know, things like triggers on this and the layout and how comfy it was is brilliant. It's just that I've used the other controllers more, and how different they and how advanced they were over this is just what puts them ahead of it. And at number 2, I would put the Xbox 360 controller, the controller that I have the most love for, probably, in terms of looking back and nostalgia and playing that generation of games and all these amazing games behind me on the 360. But yeah, I just can't put this above the Series X because I think the Series X, like I've mentioned, is the best controller ever made. This remains number 1 on that list as well. So yeah, there we have it. That's how I would rank the controllers. This is just my opinion, obviously, and you are entitled to yours. It doesn't mean it's right or anything like that. But I am really interested to hear what you think, so please do let me know down in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching and keep gaming.